Tonight, we will tell you a story about something as fundamental as prayer itself, and how its very form changed over centuries. You will learn how the simple act of communing with the divine, once free and spontaneous, slowly became a precise, disciplined art, guided by the hands of priests and the wisdom of theologians. We will journey back to the heart of the Middle Ages to uncover why certain physical postures became not just custom, but sacred law. You will discover how early Christians expressed their faith, and why this freedom gave way to uniformity, how monks, with their strict routines, influenced the wider church, why scholars began to write about the body's role in devotion, and how detailed instructions for kneeling, bowing, and prostration were written down, becoming part of every ritual. You will see how these rules shaped not only the clergy, but also every person in the pews, influencing their daily lives and their understanding of reverence itself. This is a story about the unseen mechanics of faith, and how order was brought to devotion. Oh, and if you enjoy these stories, please consider subscribing to the channel and leaving a like. New sleep stories are released here every day, all right? Find a comfortable spot, let your mind drift, and prepare to step into a time when the very act of standing or kneeling could define one's faith. The story of standardized prayer postures does not begin with rules or prohibitions. It begins in the early dawn of Christianity, a time when faith was fresh, fervent, and deeply personal, expressed in ways that were as diverse as the people who embraced the new religion. The story of how priests came to create specific lists of approved poses in the Middle Ages is a journey through centuries of evolving faith and practice. It begins far earlier than the Middle Ages themselves, in the very dawn of Christianity, when the act of worship was a deeply personal and often spontaneous expression. Imagine, if you will, the earliest Christian communities, small gatherings held in secret, often in the quiet intimacy of private homes or hidden chambers, far from the grand temples and public rituals of the Roman world. These were not elaborate ceremonies with long-established rules. They were fervent, heartfelt meetings of believers united by a common faith and often by the shared experience of persecution. In these nascent communities, prayer was a direct conversation with the divine. There was no single, universally prescribed way to stand, to kneel, or to move during worship. Instead, physical expressions were fluid, reflecting the immediate emotions and spiritual states of the worshipers. A believer might stand with arms outstretched, palms open to the heavens, in a gesture known as the orange pose, a posture of supplication and adoration inherited from ancient traditions, but now imbued with new Christian meaning. This was not a command, but a natural inclination, a physical manifestation of an open heart reaching out. In moments of deep penitence or humility, one might spontaneously fall to their knees, bowing their head in profound reverence. During intense spiritual reflection or despair, an individual might prostrate themselves fully upon the ground, a gesture of complete submission and utter dependence on God. These were not fixed rules, but rather natural, unchoreographed responses to the overwhelming presence they felt. The air in these hidden places, perhaps damp and cool, might have carried the soft murmur of many voices, each engaged in their own quiet communion, punctuated by sighs or the occasional fervent exclamation. The early Christian emphasis was overwhelmingly on the inner disposition of the heart and soul. The authenticity of one's faith, the purity of one's intentions, and the depth of one's devotion held far greater significance than any external form or ritual. The early church fathers, the influential theological writers and leaders of the early Christian church, frequently emphasized this point. They taught that true worship was not about outward show, but about an inward transformation. For them, a devout heart was more important than a perfectly executed gesture. This meant that while physical acts like bowing or kneeling were certainly present, they arose organically from the individual's spiritual state, rather than being dictated by a fixed liturgical handbook. The early Christians were focused on survival, on spreading the message, and on deepening their personal relationship with God. Their gatherings were characterized by a profound simplicity, born of necessity and genuine spiritual hunger. There were no cathedrals yet, no grand processions, no elaborate vestments. Worship was direct, immediate, and deeply personal. As Christianity slowly began to emerge from the shadows of persecution and gain acceptance within the Roman Empire, first informally and then, eventually, officially, the communities grew larger. With growth came a natural, almost imperceptible shift toward a greater need for order. When dozens, then hundreds of people gathered for communal worship, a certain level of coordination became practical. However, even with this growth, the spontaneity and individual expression of prayer persisted for a considerable time. The early Christian liturgy, the established form of public worship, was still developing. It was far from the highly structured and uniform rites that would later characterize the medieval period. Different regions and even different cities might have slightly varied customs and practices. There was no single, central authority dictating every detail of worship across the vast and diverse Christian world. This decentralization allowed for a rich tapestry of local traditions to flourish, each contributing to the evolving understanding of communal prayer. The emphasis remained on the spirit of the worship rather than the letter of the law regarding physical posture. The very concept of a list of approved poses would have seemed foreign, even unnecessary, to these early believers. Their understanding of sacred space was often fluid as they moved from house churches to catacombs, places of solemn remembrance, to open-air gatherings when conditions allowed. The environment itself often dictated the physical expression of prayer. In a small, crowded room, elaborate prostrations might be impractical. In an open field, one might naturally lift their gaze and arms to the wide sky. The sounds of daily life, the rustle of garments, the soft shuffle of feet on stone or earth, would have accompanied the fervent prayers. The focus was on the shared experience of faith, the reading of scriptures, the communal breaking of bread, and the fervent petitions offered together. It was a period of formation, a time when the very foundations of Christian worship were being laid, not through rigid rules for the body, but through the profound, often raw spiritual experiences of individuals and small communities. This informal approach to physical expression during prayer would, however, gradually give way to a greater desire for uniformity as the church matured and sought to establish a more cohesive and universal identity. The seeds of standardization were beginning to be sown, not by explicit decree, but by the natural progression of an expanding faith seeking to organize and preserve its sacred practices for generations to come. As the early centuries of Christianity unfolded, and the faith began to spread beyond small, often persecuted communities, a profound new impulse emerged within the hearts of some deeply devout believers. They sought a path of greater spiritual rigor and unyielding dedication, a way to consecrate their entire lives to God, distant from the increasing distractions, political entanglements, and worldly temptations of the burgeoning Roman Empire. This deep longing for purity and a more direct connection with the divine led to the rise of what became known as monasticism, a transformative movement where individuals, often referred to as monks or ascetics, chose to withdraw deliberately from secular society. They committed themselves to living either in profound solitude or within communal settings, dedicating their every moment to prayer, spiritual discipline, and the pursuit of holiness. Initially, many of these pioneering monastics, particularly in the arid, stark landscapes of the deserts of Egypt and Syria, embraced the life of hermits. They lived in complete isolation, often in remote caves or in simple, self-built cells, far from any human settlement. Their prayer was intensely personal, often spontaneous, and deeply internal. They would spend their days in rigorous contemplation, periods of profound fasting and demanding manual labor, such as weaving baskets or cultivating small plots of land. In these solitary lives, their physical expressions of prayer remained as varied and idiosyncratic as their individual spiritual journeys and the particular moments of their devotion. One might prostrate themselves on the rough earth. Another might stand with arms outstretched towards the sky, while a third might simply sit in quiet stillness. However, as the fame of these spiritual athletes grew, and as more and more people were drawn by the profound example of their intense devotion, it became increasingly common for these solitary hermits to gather into loose confederations. They would share spiritual guidance, offer mutual support, and sometimes even pool resources. These informal groupings, born out of shared spiritual aspiration, soon evolved into more structured and organized communities, marking the establishment of the first true monasteries, known as coenobitic communities. With the formation of these communal living arrangements, the very nature of Christian prayer began to undergo a significant transformation. It ceased to be solely a private individual act performed in isolated contemplation. It fundamentally became a shared collective endeavor, a synchronized expression of devotion. Imagine the challenge and potential for disarray within a community comprising dozens or even hundreds of monks living under a single roof, obligated to rise at fixed, precise hours throughout the day and night to participate in communal worship. In such a highly structured and well-organized environment, the informal, often wildly varied physical expressions of individual prayer, while undoubtedly born of deep sincerity, could easily lead to visual disorder, audible distraction, and a general lack of cohesion. For a large community to pray together harmoniously, efficiently, and with shared focus, a certain degree of physical uniformity and prescribed action became not merely a matter of preference, but an absolute practical and spiritual necessity. This overarching need for order and method was, in fact, central to the very essence of the monastic ideal. Monastic life, by its inherent nature, was defined by discipline, regularity, and meticulous organization. Every single aspect of a monk's day, from the earliest moments of waking before dawn to the final hours before sleep, from strenuous work in the fields or the monastery's workshops to diligent study in the scriptorium, was meticulously structured around a precise timetable and a comprehensive set of rules. This pervasive, almost militaristic organization extended naturally and inevitably to their most sacred and communal activity, prayer. The physical body, far from being merely an incidental vessel, was explicitly understood as a vital instrument of devotion, a tangible means through which the inner spiritual state could be outwardly expressed and disciplined. Consequently, its movements and postures during communal worship were to be disciplined, purposeful, and uniform. It was within this context of growing communal life and the imperative for order that immensely influential figures began the crucial work of codifying monastic practices. Perhaps the most significant and enduring among them was Saint Benedict of Nursia, a pivotal figure who lived between the late 5th and mid-6th centuries. He founded the renowned monastery of Monte Cassino in Italy, which would become a beacon of Western monasticism. His comprehensive Rule for Monasteries, universally known simply as the Rule of Saint Benedict, rapidly became the foundational and most influential text for monastic life across Western Europe. This rule provided an extraordinarily detailed blueprint for every facet of communal living, meticulously outlining everything from the specific duties and responsibilities of the abbot, the spiritual and administrative head of the monastery, to the precise allocation of food, clothing, and even the management of the monastery's temporal affairs. Crucially, and with profound implications for the future of Christian worship, it also laid out an exact and detailed schedule for the divine office, a series of fixed prayer times observed rigorously throughout the entire day and night, ensuring that prayer was a continuous, rhythmic heartbeat of the community. While the Rule of Saint Benedict did not meticulously detail every single physical gesture or posture for every moment of prayer, as such explicit rubrics would develop more fully centuries later, it absolutely and implicitly encouraged, and indeed necessitated, a highly structured and physically engaged approach to worship. It spoke repeatedly of the profound importance of reverence, deep humility, and unwavering attentiveness during communal worship, spiritual qualities that naturally and instinctively lent themselves to certain prescribed physical postures. For instance, the rule explicitly mandated prostration, the act of lying completely face down on the ground during specific penitential moments, such as the initial vows of a novice or during periods of intense communal confession. Similarly, kneeling was clearly indicated and expected during moments of fervent supplication or profound adoration. Standing was the default position for chanting psalms, signifying readiness and alertness. These were not considered arbitrary physical acts. Rather, they were understood as profound and tangible manifestations of inner spiritual states. Prostration signifying utter humility, complete submission to God, and deep repentance. Kneeling indicating fervent petition, reverence, and filial devotion. And standing conveying alert readiness and communal participation. The body, through these shared actions, became an active participant in the spiritual drama of prayer. As these disciplined monastic communities flourished and expanded across the vast expanse of early medieval Europe, they quickly became not only vital centers of spiritual excellence, but also crucial hubs of learning, scholarship, and agricultural innovation. Their highly disciplined and structured approach to communal prayer, with its inherent emphasis on regularity, uniformity, and a growing sense of prescribed physical actions, began to serve as an immensely influential model for the broader Christian church, extending beyond the cloistered walls. The monks, through their rigorous and visible practices, powerfully demonstrated how the physical body could be intentionally and effectively employed in worship, not merely as a passive container, but as an active participant designed to enhance spiritual focus, express collective devotion, and maintain order. This marked a profound and significant step away from the purely individual and often spontaneous forms of early Christian prayer, paving the way for a much more standardized, outwardly expressed, and physically engaged piety that would eventually permeate and influence the entire Christian world. The initial seeds of prescribed physical actions in worship, which would blossom into detailed rubrics, were thus sown and nurtured in the quiet, disciplined cloisters of the monasteries, slowly but surely shaping the very way Christians would outwardly express their faith and reverence for centuries to come, laying a foundational layer for the formalization that was yet to come. As the monastic traditions took root and began to influence the broader church, a powerful new force emerged in Europe, one that would profoundly shape not only the political landscape, but also the very fabric of Christian worship. This was the era of the Carolingian Renaissance, a period of intense cultural and intellectual revival that unfolded under the ambitious and far-reaching leadership of Charlemagne, king of the Franks, and later emperor of the Holy Roman Empire during the late 8th and early 9th centuries. Charlemagne, a towering figure of his time, was a man of immense vision, possessing a clear understanding that a truly unified empire required more than just military might or comprehensive legal codes. It needed a deep, common spiritual foundation, a shared understanding of faith, and, crucially, a consistent and universally applied practice of worship that transcended the myriad local customs and regional variations that had long characterized the Christian West. He envisioned a realm where political unity was mirrored by spiritual cohesion, where every subject, from the humblest peasant to the highest noble, participated in the same sacred rites, fostering a pervasive sense of shared Christian identity directly tied to his imperial authority. His overarching goal was nothing less than the complete standardization of the entire Christian liturgy across his vast dominions. Before Charlemagne's reign, liturgical practices, the established forms and ceremonies of public worship, including the words, music, and actions, varied significantly from one diocese to another, and often even from one individual church to the next within the same region. Different areas used different prayers, different hymns, and different orders of service for the same holy days. This pervasive diversity, while perhaps once seen as a vibrant testament to rich local traditions, was increasingly perceived by Charlemagne and his advisors as a potential source of confusion, disunity, and even theological error. Charlemagne firmly believed that a uniform liturgy would not only foster a profound sense of spiritual cohesion among his diverse peoples, uniting them under a single, authoritative spiritual umbrella, but also significantly strengthen his own imperial authority, presenting a unified and devout front to both God and man, thereby legitimizing his rule as divinely sanctioned and ensuring order throughout his lands. To achieve this monumental and ambitious aim, Charlemagne marshaled the intellectual and ecclesiastical resources of his empire. He dispatched highly educated scholars and trusted clerics throughout his vast territories, establishing scriptoria, centers for the copying and preservation of texts, and promoting widespread literacy among the clergy. These emissaries were tasked with the meticulous collection, accurate copying, and systematic dissemination of liturgical books, primarily based on the Roman Rite. The Roman Rite, centered in the ancient See of Rome, was at this time considered the most authoritative, ancient, and pure form of Christian worship, free from the perceived corruptions or innovations of more localized traditions. The books they circulated included sacramentaries, which contained the prayers for the Eucharist and other sacraments, lectionaries, which provided the scripture readings for each service, and antiphonaries, which compiled the chants and musical settings. The emphasis was always on absolute, meticulous accuracy, ensuring that every priest, every monk in a monastery, and every choir, from the rugged northern reaches of Francia to the sun-drenched southern borders of Lombardy, performed the sacred rites in precisely the same prescribed manner. This was not merely about the specific words spoken or the particular melodies sung. It was about establishing a universal order, a profound divine harmony that ideally mirrored the earthly order and unity Charlemagne so earnestly sought to impose, extending the reach of imperial discipline into the very heart of spiritual life. As the standardization of these crucial liturgical texts progressed and became more firmly established, it became increasingly apparent that uniformity in performance extended naturally and logically beyond just the spoken word or the chanted note. The physical performance of the rites, the very movements, gestures, and postures of the officiating clergy, particularly the priests, also needed to be brought into strict alignment. If the divine words were fixed and immutable, then the human actions accompanying those words should logically be fixed as well, ensuring a complete and seamless consistency. After all, the human body itself was understood not just as a vessel, but as an active instrument of prayer and worship, and its movements, whether deliberate or spontaneous, could profoundly either enhance or, conversely, detract from the solemnity, clarity, and reverence of the ritual. The physical presence of the priest, his precise gestures, his overall bearing, and his very posture were recognized as integral to the spiritual message being conveyed during the sacred mysteries, acting as a visual sermon in themselves. The cold stone walls of the churches and cathedrals would bear witness to this growing uniformity. Thus, the comprehensive Carolingian efforts, which had initially focused with singular intensity on textual uniformity, gradually but inevitably expanded to encompass the crucial physical dimension of worship. It was no longer deemed sufficient for a priest simply to read the correct prayers from the standardized book. He also needed to assume the correct stance, make the correct ritual signs, and perform the correct physical movements at the precise designated moments within the service. This meticulous and detailed attention to physical liturgy was driven by several interconnected factors. Firstly, it powerfully reinforced the overarching idea of a truly universal church, where the sacred actions performed in a small village church in one corner of the empire were demonstrably identical to those performed in a grand cathedral thousands of miles away. This visible uniformity fostered a sense of shared identity and belonging, a collective spiritual experience. Secondly, it aimed decisively to eliminate any perceived impropriety, irreverence, or accidental sacrilege that might arise from spontaneous, idiosyncratic, or uncoordinated movements. The liturgy was increasingly viewed as a sacred drama, a precise reenactment of divine events, and every participant, especially the priest, was a key actor whose performance needed to be flawless, prescribed, and deeply reverent. This eliminated personal interpretation of movement in favor of communal prescribed action, ensuring that external posture reflected internal devotion in a standardized manner. This meticulous approach also served a powerful didactic purpose, acting as a pervasive form of spiritual instruction. By standardizing the physical actions, the Church could systematically teach its priests, and through their consistent example, the wider congregation, a uniform and consistent vocabulary of reverence and devotion. A specific bow, for instance, executed at a particular point, or a distinctive hand gesture, or a prolonged kneeling position would come to carry a universal and unambiguous meaning, understood by all who witnessed it, regardless of their native tongue or level of literacy. It became a powerful visual language of faith, reinforcing the theological concepts and spiritual truths being expressed through the spoken and chanted liturgy, making the abstract tenets of belief tangible through the body. The profound shift from a landscape of diverse and often highly localized practices to a unified, centrally prescribed, and physically regulated form of worship was a monumental undertaking of the Carolingian era. Its lasting success laid the essential groundwork for the even more formal and detailed codification of sacred postures and rubrics that would inevitably follow in subsequent centuries. The seeds of uniformity, first sown within the disciplined walls of the monasteries, now truly began to blossom across an entire continent, guided by the strong and unifying hand of imperial authority and a deep-seated, pervasive desire for religious order and spiritual consistency. The path was now irrevocably set for a Christian world where every gesture performed in the house of God would possess its proper place, its precise meaning, and its acknowledged spiritual significance, moving ever closer to a singular, approved way of physical worship. The quiet discipline of the monastery had scaled up to become the ordered piety of an empire. As the push for uniformity in prayer deepened, extending its careful hand across the vast Carolingian Empire, it was not merely about order for order's sake. A more profound understanding of the human body's inherent role in worship began to emerge and solidify within the minds of medieval theologians and scholars. This period saw an intense and growing intellectual focus on the very nature of human existence, particularly the intricate relationship between the soul and the body. Before this time, while physical acts in prayer certainly existed, their theological underpinning was often implicit, a natural expression rather than a carefully considered doctrine. But now, in the quiet cloisters and echoing cathedrals, the brightest minds of the age turn their attention to the physical dimension of devotion, viewing the body's posture not as a mere accessory to prayer, but as a vital, visible sign of inner spiritual devotion and reverence. They grappled with ancient philosophical ideas, reconciling them with Christian doctrine. The body, often seen in some classical traditions as a lesser vessel, a potential impediment to spiritual purity, was reevaluated through the lens of Christian theology. For these thinkers, the body was not something to be entirely transcended or disregarded, but rather a creation of God, intricately woven with the soul to form the complete human person. If God himself had taken on a physical body in the person of Jesus Christ, the doctrine of the Incarnation, then the human body, in all its physicality, must possess an inherent dignity and a capacity for sacred expression. This theological truth elevated the significance of every physical action performed in the presence of the divine. Theologians argued that the inner state of the soul, its humility, its adoration, its penitence, or its joy, naturally sought outward expression. Just as a furrowed brow might betray deep thought or a smile inner happiness, so too did the postures of the body during prayer reveal the spiritual disposition of the worshiper. A slumped posture might suggest indifference or disrespect, while an upright stance could signify attentiveness and readiness. Kneeling, for instance, became a powerful symbol of submission and humility, echoing the biblical narratives of figures bowing before God. Prostration, lying face down on the ground, represented ultimate self-abasement and complete surrender to divine will, a profound act of acknowledging one's utter dependence on God. Each deliberate movement, each held position, was understood to be a form of prayer in itself, a silent language spoken not with words, but with the very being. This focus meant that how one held oneself during prayer was not a matter of personal preference, but a matter of spiritual integrity. The body became a canvas upon which the soul's devotion was painted, a living testament to faith. It was believed that engaging the body in prayer not only expressed devotion, but also deepened it. The physical act itself could help to focus the wandering mind, to quiet the distractions of the world, and to draw the worshiper more fully into the sacred moment. For a monk spending hours in prayer, the discipline of a particular posture could become a form of asceticism, a way of training the body to serve the spirit, much like a soldier trains his body for battle. The cold stone floors of the monastery chapel, upon which one might kneel for hours, became silent witnesses to this intertwining of physical discipline and spiritual growth. The weight of one's own body pressing down could serve as a constant, tangible reminder of one's unworthiness and the immense majesty of God. Furthermore, these theologians drew connections between communal prayer and the collective body of Christ, the Church. If the Church was a unified body, then its members, when gathered for worship, should reflect that unity in their physical actions. Disparate, individualistic postures might detract from the sense of common purpose and shared devotion. Therefore, encouraging standardized postures was not just about aesthetics or discipline, it was also about fostering a deeper sense of communal identity and shared spiritual experience. When everyone knelt at the same moment or bowed their heads in unison, It created a powerful shared rhythm of devotion that resonated throughout the congregation, reinforcing the idea that they were all part of something larger than themselves, moving as one toward God. This theological groundwork laid the intellectual foundation for what would follow. It was no longer enough for prayer to be heartfelt. It also needed to be properly embodied. The inner devotion, while paramount, needed an outer form that was appropriate, respectful, and universally understood within the Christian community. This conceptual shift meant that the casual, spontaneous, physical expressions of earlier Christian worship, while perhaps sincere, were increasingly viewed as insufficient for a burgeoning, unified church seeking to express its faith with dignity and order. The body, once a largely uncodified participant in prayer, was now seen as a vital instrument, capable of both reflecting and shaping the soul's ascent towards the divine. This understanding necessitated a more structured approach to physical performance, paving the way for the explicit instructions that would soon become ubiquitous in liturgical practice. The stage was now set for the formal codification of these sacred postures, transforming abstract theological ideas into concrete, prescribed actions for every priest and eventually every believer. This intellectual movement was a crucial step in formalizing the relationship between the physical and the spiritual in medieval Christian life. 6 chapter 199 characters. As the push for uniformity in prayer deepened, extending its careful hand across the vast Carolingian Empire, it was not merely about order for order's sake. A more profound understanding of the human body's inherent role in worship began to emerge and solidify within the minds of medieval theologians and scholars. This period saw an intense and growing intellectual focus on the very nature of human existence, particularly the intricate relationship between the soul and the body. Before this time, while physical acts and prayer certainly existed, their theological underpinning was often implicit, a natural expression rather than a carefully considered doctrine. But now, in the quiet cloisters and echoing cathedrals, the brightest minds of the age turned their attention to the physical dimension of devotion, viewing the body's posture not as a mere accessory to prayer, but as a vital, visible sign of inner spiritual devotion and reverence. They grappled with ancient philosophical ideas, reconciling them with Christian doctrine. The body, often seen in some classical traditions as a lesser vessel, a potential impediment to spiritual purity, was reevaluated through the lens of Christian theology. For these thinkers, the body was not something to be entirely transcended or disregarded, but rather a creation of God, intricately woven with the soul, to form the complete human person. If God Himself had taken on a physical body in the person of Jesus Christ, the doctrine of the Incarnation, then the human body, in all its physicality, must possess an inherent dignity and a capacity for sacred expression. This theological truth elevated the significance of every physical action performed in the presence of the divine. Theologians argued that the inner state of the soul, its humility, its adoration, its penitence, or its joy, naturally sought outward expression. Just as a furrowed brow might betray deep thought or a smile inner happiness, so too did the postures of the body during prayer reveal the spiritual disposition of the worshiper. A slumped posture might suggest indifference or disrespect, while an upright stance could signify attentiveness and readiness. Kneeling, for instance, became a powerful symbol of submission and humility, echoing the biblical narratives of figures bowing before God. Prostration, lying face down on the ground, represented ultimate self-abasement and complete surrender to divine will, a profound act of acknowledging one's utter dependence on God. Each deliberate movement, each held position, was understood to be a form of prayer in itself, a silent language spoken not with words, but with the very being. This focus meant that how one held oneself during prayer was not a matter of personal preference, but a matter of spiritual integrity. The body became a canvas upon which the soul's devotion was painted, a living testament to faith. It was believed that engaging the body in prayer not only expressed devotion, but also deepened it. The physical act itself could help to focus the wandering mind, to quiet the distractions of the world, and to draw the worshiper more fully into the sacred moment. For a monk, spending hours in prayer, the discipline of a particular posture could become a form of asceticism, a way of training the body to serve the spirit, much like a soldier trains his body for battle. The cold stone floors of the monastery chapel, upon which one might kneel for hours, became silent witnesses to this intertwining of physical discipline and spiritual growth. The weight of one's own body, pressing down, could serve as a constant, tangible reminder of one's unworthiness and the immense majesty of God. Furthermore, these theologians drew connections between communal prayer and the collective body of Christ, the church. If the church was a unified body, then its members, when gathered for worship, should reflect that unity in their physical actions. Disparate individualistic postures might detract from the sense of common purpose and shared devotion. Therefore, encouraging standardized postures was not just about aesthetics or discipline. It was also about fostering a deeper sense of communal identity and shared spiritual experience. When everyone knelt at the same moment or bowed their heads in unison, it created a powerful, shared rhythm of devotion that resonated throughout the congregation, reinforcing the idea that they were all part of something larger than themselves, moving as one toward God. This theological groundwork laid the intellectual foundation for what would follow. It was no longer enough for prayer to be heartfelt. It also needed to be properly embodied. The inner devotion, while paramount, needed an outer form that was appropriate, respectful, and universally understood within the Christian community. This conceptual shift meant that the casual, spontaneous, physical expressions of earlier Christian worship, while perhaps sincere, were increasingly viewed as insufficient for a burgeoning, unified church seeking to express its faith with dignity and order. The body, once a largely uncodified participant in prayer, was now seen as a vital instrument, capable of both reflecting and shaping the soul's ascent towards the divine. This understanding necessitated a more structured approach to physical performance, paving the way for the explicit instructions that would soon become ubiquitous in liturgical practice. The stage was now set for the formal codification of these sacred postures, transforming abstract theological ideas into concrete, prescribed actions for every priest and eventually every believer. This intellectual movement was a crucial step in formalizing the relationship between the physical and the spiritual in medieval Christian life. As the theological understanding of the human body deepened, evolving from a mere vessel to a sacred instrument, capable of expressing profound devotion, the very fabric of Christian worship began to transform. No longer were spontaneous, informal gestures always sufficient to convey the gravitas of the sacred mysteries. Over centuries, particularly as the Church consolidated its influence and sought to standardize its practices across vast territories, the rituals themselves grew in complexity and solemnity, developing into the elaborate forms we associate with the medieval period. This expansion of the liturgy, the public worship of the Church, naturally led to a compelling and undeniable need for prescribed actions and specific positions, especially for those at the very heart of these ceremonies, the clergy. Consider the central act of Christian worship, the Mass, which commemorates the sacrifice of Christ. In the earliest days, its celebration might have been a more fluid affair, adapted to the immediate context of a house church or a simple gathering. However, by the Middle Ages, the Mass had evolved into a highly structured and deeply symbolic drama. Each gesture, each word, each movement was believed to carry immense spiritual weight. The transformation of bread and wine into the body and blood of Christ, known as the transubstantiation, became the focal point of the ceremony. This moment, of such profound theological significance, demanded absolute reverence and precision. It was no longer acceptable for a priest to merely improvise his actions. The sacredness of the moment required a uniformity of posture and gesture that transcended individual interpretation, ensuring that the mystery was treated with the highest possible respect and that its validity was beyond question. Beyond the Mass, countless other liturgical rites were developing and solidifying. There were the 7 sacraments, each requiring specific actions: the pouring of water in baptism, the anointing with oil in confirmation and extreme unction, the exchange of vows in marriage, the laying on of hands in ordination, and the confession of sins in penance. There were also the daily hours of prayer, observed in monastic communities and cathedrals, known as the Divine Office, which involved chanting, reading, and specific bodily dispositions for different psalms or prayers. Processions, blessings, exorcisms, and dedication ceremonies for churches all became more formalized, each requiring precise movements and postures from the officiating clergy. This increasing elaboration of ritual was not merely for show. It was deeply rooted in the theological conviction that the physical realm could serve as a conduit for the spiritual. If the body was an integral part of the human person, and if human beings were to offer their whole selves to God, then their physical actions during worship had to reflect their inner spiritual state. A priest acting in persona Christi, meaning in the person of Christ, during the consecration, could not appear casual or haphazard. His movements had to convey the sacred authority and profound humility appropriate for one handling the divine. The very dignity of the liturgy, and by extension, the perceived holiness of the Church, depended on the structured and orderly performance of these rites. Furthermore, the medieval Church was a vast, sprawling organization, encompassing diverse cultures and regions across Europe. For the faith to remain unified and for the sacraments to be recognized as valid everywhere, a common understanding and practice of the liturgy were essential. If a priest in France performed the Mass with entirely different gestures than a priest in Germany, it could lead to confusion, doubt, and even schism. The need for prescribed actions, therefore, became apparent as a means of ensuring uniformity and cohesion across the entire Latin Church. It was a way to create a shared spiritual language understood by all, regardless of their local dialect or customs. This standardization helped to reinforce the universal nature of the Church and its doctrines. The development of cathedrals and large monastic complexes also contributed to this need. Worship was no longer confined to small, intimate spaces. Grand churches, with their soaring ceilings and intricate altars, demanded a sense of order and spectacle. In such vast spaces, the movements of the clergy had to be clear, deliberate, and visible to a large congregation. A priest's actions at the altar, or a bishop's blessing from his cathedra, his episcopal chair, needed to be performed with a dignity that matched the architectural grandeur and the solemnity of the occasion. This public nature of worship in impressive ecclesiastical buildings further highlighted the importance of prescribed rather than arbitrary physical expressions. Moreover, the clergy were not just performing actions, they were teaching through their actions. For a largely illiterate population, the visual aspect of the liturgy was paramount. The priest's every bow, every genuflection, every extension of his hands was a silent sermon, instructing the faithful in the proper reverence due to God. If these physical expressions were inconsistent, the message would be muddled. Thus, the evolving complexity of the liturgy, driven by theological deepening, the need for uniformity across the Church, and the demands of public worship in grand settings, made it unequivocally clear that the actions and positions of the clergy could no longer be left to chance or individual preference. They had to be codified, taught, and strictly adhered to, paving the way for the explicit instructions that would soon fill liturgical books. This growing awareness of the body's role in conveying sacred meaning was a fundamental step towards the formal listing of approved poses. As the sacred rites of the medieval Church became more intricate and universally adopted, a profound new necessity emerged: the precise documentation of how these rituals were to be performed. It was no longer sufficient for a priest to merely understand the words of the liturgy. He also needed to know with absolute certainty the exact physical actions that accompanied them. This pressing need for clarity, consistency, and standardization across the vast and ever-growing Christian world gave birth to what would become known as rubrics, a term derived directly from the Latin word rubrica, meaning red earth or red chalk. These essential instructions were so named because, in the painstakingly handwritten liturgical books and missals of the time, they were invariably inscribed in vibrant red ink, a stark and immediate contrast to the solemn black ink used for the main text of the prayers, readings, and chants. This visual distinction was not merely decorative, it was a practical and vital signal, clearly setting apart the actions from the words, guiding the celebrant through the sacred drama. These rubrics were far from vague suggestions or general guidelines. They were detailed, explicit commands, leaving virtually no room for individual interpretation, personal preference, or spontaneous improvisation. They meticulously outlined every gesture, every specific movement, and every precise pose a priest was to adopt during the Mass, during the solemn administration of sacraments such as baptism or communion, or during the daily recitation of the divine offices. Imagine, for instance, a rubric that might instruct a priest to stand facing the altar with hands extended, palms facing upward, thumbs touching, at a particular point in the canon of the Mass. Moments later, another rubric might direct him to kneel profoundly, bowing the head low in adoration, or to make the sign of the cross over the elements of bread and wine, extending the right hand fully, with fingers joined. The exact placement of hands, the precise direction of gaze, the specific timing to bow the head or genuflect, the manner of holding the chalice or paten, all were now subject to specific written directives, meticulously recorded and diligently followed. The weight of the parchment, the scent of the ink, the very act of turning a page became part of the disciplined ritual. The introduction and gradual proliferation of rubrics marked a truly significant shift from an earlier, more fluid, and often localized approach to liturgical performance. In the nascent centuries of Christian worship, much of the physical expression during communal prayer had been informal, even somewhat spontaneous, varying from one community to another. While certain fundamental actions like standing erect for prayer or kneeling in humble penitence were common and widely understood, there existed no comprehensive, universally accepted guide dictating the precise choreography of the clergy. However, as the Church expanded its reach and sought to unify its practices across its vast territories, especially in the wake of influential movements like the Carolingian Renaissance, which championed a unified liturgy across the Holy Roman Empire, the need for such precise and unambiguous instructions became absolutely paramount. A priest celebrating the Holy Mass in a remote monastery in the forests of Francia needed to perform the sacred rites in precisely the same manner as his counterpart in a bustling cathedral in the heart of Italy, or in a newly established parish in the distant lands of Saxony. This ensured that the spiritual experience, though personal, was rooted in a shared universal expression of faith. This enforced uniformity was not merely an aesthetic choice, nor was it simply a matter of administrative efficiency. It was deeply theological at its core. The Church firmly believed that proper and efficacious worship required not only the correct words to be uttered, but also the correct bodily disposition and action to be undertaken. The physical actions and postures of the priest were seen as an integral and indispensable part of the sacred offering itself, a visible manifestation of the profound inner reverence, humility, and devotion that was due to God. Any deviation from these prescribed actions, any misstep or improvised gesture, could potentially diminish the efficacy of the sacrament, introduce an element of error, or even be perceived as a sign of irreverence or disrespect towards the divine. Therefore, rubrics served as a crucial safeguard, a bulwark against error, ensuring that the sacred rites were performed with the utmost dignity, precision, and theological correctness, preserving the sanctity of the ritual. Furthermore, the increasing complexity of liturgical vestments, the often elaborate arrangements of the altar, and the growing array of ceremonial objects also necessitated exceptionally clear and detailed instructions. A priest, often clad in heavy, richly embroidered robes, standing before an altar adorned with candles, crosses, and relics, and surrounded by various sacred implements, needed to know exactly when and how to handle each item, when to raise the chalice, when to place the paten, when to turn to face the congregation, when to process, and when to remain perfectly still, holding a specific pose. These meticulously written instructions minimized confusion, prevented costly errors, and allowed the intricate beauty and profound solemnity of the medieval liturgy to unfold smoothly, reverently, and without interruption. The very act of diligently following these detailed instructions became a powerful form of spiritual discipline for the clergy, a constant, tangible reminder of the immense gravity, the sacredness, and the precise responsibility of their role as mediators between the human and the divine. The vibrant red ink, standing out starkly on the pale parchment, was a constant visual cue, a silent, authoritative voice guiding the priest through the intricate sacred dance of the divine service. It transformed the act of worship from a general, sometimes varied devotional expression into a highly structured, meticulously orchestrated performance, where every single movement had deep theological meaning and every posture conveyed a specific, understood spiritual truth, echoing the universal order of creation itself. The development of detailed rubrics, those precise instructions meticulously written in red ink within the liturgical books, gradually led to an even more profound standardization of worship. It was no longer enough simply to indicate where a priest should stand or when to make the sign of the cross. The very form of the body, the specific angles and positions, began to be formally defined and universally adopted across the Latin West. This was not a sudden top-down decree, but an organic evolution driven by the deep-seated desire for theological clarity, spiritual uniformity, and a more perfect expression of devotion. The Church, in its efforts to create a cohesive and universally understood form of piety, recognized the immense power of physical action to convey internal spiritual states. Among these sacred postures, kneeling emerged as one of the most significant and widespread, transitioning from an occasional, spontaneous gesture to a codified and expected element of prayer, while prostration, lying fully outstretched on the ground, had ancient roots as a gesture of profound humility and supplication. Kneeling offered a more practical, yet equally potent expression of reverence that could be sustained for longer periods. It was a posture that spoke eloquently of penitence, of submission to divine will, and of earnest, heartfelt prayer. For centuries, various forms of kneeling had been practiced within different local customs, but now the act of bending both knees before God, especially during moments of consecration or intense personal and communal prayer, became a prescribed and universally anticipated part of both clerical and lay devotion. This posture profoundly signaled a recognition of God's infinite majesty, the worshipper's humble unworthiness, and a profound plea for mercy and divine intervention. It became the default position for private prayer and a key moment in the Mass, especially during the elevation of the host, when the worshiper knelt to adore the true presence of Christ. Bowing to acquired specific definitions and nuanced meanings, reflecting different degrees of reverence and respect. A deep bow, where the upper body bent significantly from the waist, was reserved for moments of profound adoration and confession of faith. This might occur during the recitation of the Creed at the mention of the Incarnation, acknowledging the mystery of God becoming man, or before the consecrated host and chalice, recognizing the real presence of Christ. This profound gesture was an acknowledgment of ultimate divine authority and sacred presence, a physical embodiment of the words, "My Lord and my God." A less pronounced bow, a simple inclination of the head or shoulders, conveyed respect for sacred objects, for the holy name of Jesus, for the names of the saints, or for persons in authority, such as a bishop or a crucifix. Each degree of bend, meticulously outlined in the rubrics and reinforced by tradition, carried its own specific weight of meaning, guiding the faithful in their precise and appropriate expression of reverence. These subtle differences ensured that every gesture was intentional and understood. Prostration, though less frequent in daily or weekly worship, held the highest symbolic value among all physical expressions of prayer. It was primarily reserved for the most solemn occasions, moments of profound commitment or deep penitence, such as ordinations, where candidates lay prone before the altar in total surrender to their calling, monastic professions, symbolizing a complete dedication to God, or during the Good Friday services, in imitation of Christ's suffering and death, to lie face down on the cold stone floor, often with arms outstretched in the shape of a cross, was to utterly humble oneself, to surrender completely to God's will, mirroring Christ's prostration in the Garden of Gethsemane. This act was a powerful visual representation of total submission, a willingness to be utterly vulnerable before the divine, and an earnest plea for mercy that transcended words. It was a physical death to self, preceding a spiritual rebirth or a profound, life-altering commitment. The act itself was physically demanding, reinforcing its gravity. The codification of these postures was not merely about aesthetics or about imposing military-like drill upon the congregation. It was deeply and profoundly theological. It was firmly believed that the external disposition of the body directly influenced, and indeed prepared and perfected, the internal state of the soul. A correctly performed posture was thought to open the heart to grace, to express devotion more perfectly, and to unite the individual worshiper with the collective body of the Church in a shared visible act of faith. These standardized forms ensured that regardless of where a Christian traveled within the vast and diverse lands of Europe, from the bustling markets of Italy to the remote monasteries of Ireland, they would encounter the same recognizable gestures of worship, fostering an unparalleled sense of unity and shared spiritual identity that transcended local dialects and customs. The adoption and universal spread of these specific poses was greatly facilitated by the growing influence of monastic orders, whose disciplined lives, rigorous prayer schedules, and communal prayers served as ideal models of spiritual order and physical devotion. What often began as internal monastic regulations for the monks' daily offices often spread outwards, influencing parish practices as former monks became bishops or priests. Bishops, eager to standardize worship across their often vast dioceses and ensure doctrinal purity, actively encouraged the adoption of these common postures. Furthermore, the very architecture of the churches began to subtly reflect and reinforce these practices, with designated spaces for kneeling benches or open areas for standing and prostrating, further cementing these postures' indispensable place in the liturgical landscape and the daily lives of the faithful. This meant that the physical space itself guided the worshiper. Thus, the human body itself became a silent, yet immensely eloquent language of faith. Each bend, each inclination, each moment of stillness imbued with layers of profound theological meaning. The worshiper was not merely a passive observer present during the liturgy. They were an active participant, their physical form and gestures echoing the profound truths of their belief. This meticulous attention to physical posture transformed medieval worship into a highly choreographed and deeply symbolic sacred drama where every movement had a defined purpose and every stance conveyed a specific devotional state. You were no longer just hearing the prayer or passively listening to the sacred text. You were enacting it with your entire being, forging a deeper, more visceral connection to the divine through the very fabric of your physical presence. This deliberate and uniform practice allowed for a universal understanding of devotion, transcending language barriers, binding communities together through shared physical acts of reverence before God, and fostering a profound sense of communal identity in Christ. This standardization, therefore, became a cornerstone of medieval Christian piety, shaping not only how one prayed, but how one understood their place in the universe. With the physical forms of prayer now clearly delineated, a deeper question arose. What did these postures mean? It was no longer sufficient for individuals to simply perform the prescribed actions. They needed to understand the profound spiritual significance embedded within each movement. The Church, through its theologians and spiritual guides, began to articulate the specific purpose and inner grace associated with kneeling, bowing, and prostration, transforming them from mere physical acts into potent expressions of faith. This articulation became crucial as it allowed the faithful to engage not just with their bodies, but with their entire being in the act of worship. One of the most fundamental and widely adopted postures was kneeling. To kneel, you see, was to assume a position of profound humility and supplication. When a person knelt, they were intentionally lowering themselves, bringing their body closer to the earth, a symbolic act of acknowledging their own smallness before the infinite majesty of God. It was a physical confession of dependence, an admission that all strength, all grace, and all salvation came from a divine source beyond oneself. Kneeling became especially significant during moments of intense prayer, during confession of sins, or when receiving the sacred elements of the Eucharist. Imagine the cold stone floor beneath your knees, the slight ache, a gentle reminder of the sacrifice and penitence. This discomfort, however slight, was seen not as a punishment, but as a small offering, a tangible expression of earnestness in prayer. It was a posture that spoke of a heart laid bare, ready to receive divine mercy. For the medieval Christian, to kneel was to cast aside pride and to open oneself fully to the will of heaven, seeking forgiveness, expressing gratitude, or pleading for intervention. Then there was the act of bowing, a gesture of reverence and adoration that varied in its depth and meaning. A simple bow of the head, a slight inclination, was typically used to show respect for sacred names, such as the name of Jesus, or when passing before a crucifix or an image of a saint. It was a quick yet meaningful acknowledgement of holiness and spiritual presence. A more profound bow, involving bending the entire upper body from the waist, was reserved for moments of deeper reverence, such as during the Creed when acknowledging the incarnation of Christ, or when facing the altar during specific parts of the liturgy. This deeper bow was a physical expression of awe, a silent declaration of worship before the divine mystery. It allowed the worshiper to lower their gaze, focusing inward and upward simultaneously, recognizing the sacredness of the moment and the presence of the divine. Unlike kneeling, which emphasized supplication, bowing primarily conveyed adoration and honor, a recognition of something infinitely greater than oneself. Finally, the most extreme and powerful posture was prostration, where the individual would lie face down on the ground. This was not a common daily act, but was reserved for the most solemn and significant occasions, such as ordinations, where candidates for priesthood or monastic vows would lie prostrate before the altar. It was also practiced on Good Friday, symbolizing profound sorrow and identification with Christ's suffering and death. Prostration was the ultimate physical expression of humility, signifying complete self-abasement, a total surrender of the self to God. It was a gesture of utter vulnerability, as if one was laying down their entire being, their very life, before the divine. In this posture, the individual became dust, returning to the earth from which they came and from which they hoped for a spiritual rebirth. It symbolized a complete yielding, a readiness to die to one's own will and rise anew in service to God. The feeling of the rough floor against your cheek, the sense of being utterly helpless and yet completely dedicated, was meant to strip away all worldly distractions and focus the soul entirely on the divine. These theological explanations were not merely academic exercises. They were deeply integrated into the spiritual instruction of the faithful. Priests and monastic leaders taught that performing these gestures with understanding transformed a simple physical motion into a profound spiritual act. It was believed that the outward posture influenced the inward state, helping to cultivate humility, foster adoration, and deepen penitence. By physically embodying these virtues, the worshiper was believed to draw closer to God, not just in spirit, but in a unified experience of body and soul. The body became a tool for prayer, a vessel through which the soul could express its deepest longings and reverence. This careful articulation of meaning behind the motion ensured that the standardized postures were not just about uniformity, but about a shared, profound spiritual journey. The standardization of prayer postures was not a practice intended solely for the learned clergy within the solemn confines of the chancel, that sacred space near the altar. It was, in fact, absolutely crucial that the entire congregation, every man, woman, and child gathered in the expansive nave, also understood and diligently adopted these practices. The Church, in its profound wisdom and far-reaching vision, recognized that for communal worship to be truly unified, universally comprehensible, and deeply reverent in spirit, the faithful had to participate physically in a prescribed, consistent manner. This immense responsibility, this monumental task of instructing and gently guiding millions across vast territories and diverse cultures, fell squarely upon the dedicated shoulders of the local priests. They became the primary instructors, the living exemplars of how to properly engage with the sacred, embodying the very essence of devotion for all to see and emulate. You must endeavor to understand the context of the Middle Ages, for the church building itself and the elaborate rituals performed within its hallowed, often incense-filled walls represented the very core of their spiritual and frequently their their social existence. People attended Mass regularly, sometimes even daily, traversing difficult paths to be present, but their understanding of Latin, the sacred language of the liturgy, was frequently limited or even entirely non-existent. The profound words spoken by the priest, though undoubtedly holy and imbued with divine power, often remained a linguistic mystery to many of the congregants. Therefore, physical participation, the deliberate adoption of specific shared postures, became an absolutely vital and tangible means of engagement. It transformed worship into a universal language that everyone, regardless of literacy or social standing, could understand. A clear, unmistakable way to express devotion, deep penitence, and overwhelming adoration, even if the precise meaning of the Latin phrases remained beyond their intellectual grasp. It was a tangible, accessible pathway, a direct physical connection to the divine. Priests imparted these essential poses and their profound meanings through a combination of careful, often repeated, spoken instruction and powerful, consistent, visual demonstration. During their sermons, which were typically delivered in the vernacular, the common language of the people, they would meticulously explain the theological reasons behind each prescribed posture. They might describe, for instance, with earnest conviction, how kneeling, feeling the cool, unyielding press of the ancient stone floor beneath one's knees, symbolized profound humility before the Creator, a humble recognition of one's utter smallness and dependence in the face of God's infinite majesty and boundless power. Or they would elaborate on how prostration, lying fully prone upon the ground, with one's face almost touching the earth, expressed the deepest form of penitence, an utter, complete surrender to divine will and an overwhelming, all-consuming sense of adoration. They tirelessly emphasized that these actions were not mere empty gestures, not simply outward displays devoid of inner substance or feeling, but rather essential, outward manifestations of a sincere, deeply felt, and heartfelt inner spiritual state. It was a holistic, integrated approach to worship, where the physical body and the immortal soul were meant to align perfectly, moving in synchronized concert, in profound and visible reverence. Perhaps even more effective and deeply impactful than spoken words was the powerful, silent visual lesson provided by the priests themselves. As you, the humble worshiper, stood quietly in the echoing vast nave of the church, surrounded by the hushed reverence of the congregation, a collective anticipation hanging palpably in the cool, still air, your gaze would naturally be drawn to and fixed upon the priest at the altar. You would watch intently and respectfully as he knelt at precisely designated key moments during the sacred service, his vestments, perhaps of richly embroidered velvet or more humble yet dignified linen, rustling softly against the ancient cold stone floor. You would observe him bow deeply and reverently during the solemn transformative moment of the consecration, his head lowered in profound, visible respect for the transubstantiated elements, the body and blood of Christ. These were not just actions he performed as part of his liturgical duty. They were deliberate, carefully choreographed demonstrations, silent yet immensely eloquent, lessons for all the faithful to meticulously follow and internalize. The very architecture of the medieval church, often designed with clear, unobstructed sightlines towards the high altar, purposefully facilitated this crucial visual instruction, ensuring that every gesture was seen, every posture noted, and every movement understood. The congregation in turn learned through a potent combination of diligent observation and careful, often unconscious, imitation. Children, their eyes wide with innocent curiosity, would watch their parents, their elders, and quickly begin mimicking their movements, internalizing the ritual from a tender age, absorbing it into their very being. Newcomers to the faith or visitors from other regions would learn from their neighbors in the pews, subtly adjusting their own postures to conform to the established local practice. Over weeks, months, and even years, these standardized postures became so deeply ingrained, so habitual, that they transformed into a communal, almost instinctive choreography of shared faith. The rhythmic, synchronized sound of many knees dropping to the floor, a soft, resonant thud echoing in the vast, vaulted space, the collective bowing of hundreds of heads in unison, the subtle rustle of clothing as people shifted smoothly and reverently from one prescribed pose to another. These sounds and movements became an utterly integral, almost defining part of the collective worship experience. It fostered an unparalleled sense of unity, a communal expression of piety that transcended individual understanding of the spoken word, binding everyone together in a powerful, shared physical act of devotion. Occasionally, though less frequently than sermons or visual cues, priests would offer more direct, personalized guidance. This might occur in smaller, more intimate settings, such as during catechism classes held in the sacristy, or perhaps during a quiet moment after a service when a parishioner sought clarification. They might gently correct an awkward or incorrect stance, or softly remind someone of the proper way to perform the sign of the cross, meticulously explaining the spiritual significance of each part of the gesture. This was rarely about rigid enforcement or public shaming. Rather, it was consistently about gentle, patient, pastoral guidance, ensuring that everyone felt included, capable, and confident in performing these essential acts of devotion correctly and meaningfully. The ultimate aim was never to create automatons, blindly following rote rules, but to deepen personal faith through embodied conscious practice, connecting the inner spirit with outward reverent action. The profound and far-reaching impact of this widespread systematic instruction cannot be overstated in its historical significance. It fundamentally transformed prayer from an often abstract, these meticulously defined postures, initially developed for the clergy and the solemn performance of the Mass, did not remain confined to the sacred space of the altar or the monastic cell. They gradually, but profoundly, permeated the wider fabric of Christian society, shaping the devotional lives of ordinary men and women throughout the Middle Ages. The instructions given to priests for their own liturgical actions naturally extended to their role as teachers of the faithful, becoming a fundamental part of Christian pedagogy. Just as a priest was expected to kneel at the moment of consecration, signifying the profound mystery of the Eucharist, so too was the congregation gently yet firmly guided to adopt similar reverent positions during key moments of worship. This was not about rigid enforcement, but about cultivating a shared spiritual language. You see, the medieval church understood that faith was not merely an abstract thought or an internal feeling confined to the mind. It was a lived experience, embodied and expressed through every fiber of one's being. When you attended Mass or participated in a grand procession through the town square, you were not just a passive observer, you were an active participant, and your body was considered an essential instrument of your devotion, a vessel through which your inner piety could be made visible and amplified. The priests, having been thoroughly trained in the proper execution of these rubrics during their own formation and daily practice, became the living examples and primary instructors for their congregations. They would not only verbally explain the significance of bowing or kneeling, but would also physically demonstrate the correct way to genuflect before the altar, to bow deeply at the name of Jesus, or to make the sign of the cross with precision and reverence. This visual instruction was far more effective than any sermon alone, particularly in an age where formal literacy was not widespread among the common people. The movements themselves became a universal language understood by all, conveying reverence, humility, and profound submission to the divine. This formalization of physical expression had several significant and far-reaching effects on the Christian world. Firstly, it fostered a remarkable degree of uniformity in worship across vast geographical areas, binding disparate communities together. Whether you were in a bustling cathedral in Chartres, with its soaring stone arches and stained glass windows filtering the light, or a small, humble parish church in rural England, with its simple wooden pews and earthen floor, or even a remote monastery nestled deep in the German forest, the fundamental postures of prayer would be recognized and practiced in a strikingly similar manner. This created a powerful sense of shared identity and communal belonging among Christians, transcending local customs, regional dialects, and social distinctions. When everyone knelt at the same moment, a tangible unity of spirit was forged, a collective act of adoration that bound individuals together in a common purpose, reinforcing the concept of the universal church, the ecclesia, as a single body of Christ spread throughout the known world. Secondly, these prescribed movements instilled a deep sense of discipline and order within the individual believer, transforming personal piety. Prior to these widespread codifications, prayer could be an intensely personal and often spontaneous act, varying greatly from one person to another. While this spontaneity held its own unique spiritual value, the introduction of structured postures brought a new dimension of self-control, intentionality, and focus to the act of worship. You were not simply praying, you were praying with your entire being, consciously engaging your physical self in the act of devotion. The physical act of bowing or kneeling, of holding a specific posture for an extended period, required a conscious effort, a deliberate surrender of the body, which in turn profoundly reinforced the spiritual act of humility, reverence, and submission to divine will. It was a constant, tangible reminder that true worship involved the whole person, mind, spirit, and flesh, working in harmony. This physical discipline often aided in quieting the mind, overcoming distractions, and cultivating a deeper, more sustained connection with the divine. Moreover, these postures became powerful mnemonic devices, deeply embedding complex theological concepts and narratives into the very muscle memory and subconscious of the faithful. When you knelt, you remembered Christ's profound humility and his suffering, When you prostrated yourself fully on the ground, you recalled the profound sinfulness of humanity in the face of God's overwhelming holiness and majesty, an act of ultimate submission and penance. The act of standing during the gospel reading signified deep respect for the divine word of God, while sitting during the sermon indicated attentive listening and readiness to receive instruction. Each movement was meticulously imbued with layers of theological and spiritual meaning, transforming simple physical actions into profound, living spiritual statements. These were not arbitrary rules imposed for control. They were carefully considered embodiments of doctrine, piety, and the narrative of salvation, designed to catechize the body as well as the mind. The impact of this extended well beyond the formal liturgy celebrated within church walls. These approved poses began to profoundly influence and shape private devotion within homes and daily life. A farmer working diligently in the fields might pause his labor, drop to his knees on the soil, and offer a quick prayer of thanks or supplication before resuming his work. A traveling merchant making his way along a dusty, winding road might instinctively make the sign of the cross when passing a wayside shrine or hearing the distant peal of church bells. The habit of incorporating specific physical acts of reverence into daily life became second nature, an ingrained part of the Christian identity. Prayer became less about finding the perfect words or intellectual contemplation and more about assuming the right attitude, both internally and externally, at any given moment. The body, once perhaps seen as merely a temporary vessel for the immortal soul, was now understood and utilized as an active participant in the journey of faith, capable of expressing and deepening spiritual truth through its very form and posture. This profound and enduring legacy continues to resonate even today, centuries later. Many of the fundamental gestures and postures we instinctively associate with Christian worship, from kneeling during moments of prayer and communion to making the sign of the cross upon oneself, have their roots firmly planted in these medieval codifications. The concerted efforts of priests, bishops, and theologians to standardize and systematically teach these bodily expressions of faith laid a foundational layer of shared practice that endured for centuries, shaping the very essence of Western Christian devotion. They transformed a diverse collection of individual spiritual impulses into a unified, visible, and deeply symbolic language of devotion, shaping not only the way people prayed, but also their fundamental understanding of their place within the divine order and their relationship with God. The silent, yet eloquent language of the body, carefully guided and instructed by the Church, became a powerful and enduring conduit for spiritual expression, a testament to the timeless human need to physically manifest what is held most sacred within the heart and soul.